And the people who put it together are very, very serious people indeed. One is Michael Schulenburg, who is a diplomat, a very senior German diplomat, former deputy UN Secretary General. He's held all kinds of positions. He's a person with an extraordinary record behind him, and from a family, by the way, a very famous diplomatic family. And the other was another one was Harald Kujat, who was a German general, and he was, of course, Germany's senior general. And he was, for a time, I believe, the senior general within NATO itself. So we're talking about, very experienced people. And they've looked at all of this. And what they've come up, what they've produced, what they've provided us with, is some absolutely fascinating and really extremely disturbing information. So you're absolutely right. There were negotiations going on in February and March. We covered them at the time. And those negotiations, somewhat to our surprise at the time and later, actually were very successful. The Ukrainians and the Russians found a lot of common ground. Basically, they both agreed that NATO membership for Ukraine was impossible. And all the other pieces, once that point had been reached, all the other pieces fell into place. And it turns out that there were lots of people mediating and helping along with the process. There was the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, Naftali Bennett. There was President Lukashenko of Belarus. There was President Erdogan of Turkey. There was Roman Abramovich, the businessman. And there was also the former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder. They were all involved. And they all came very close to an agreement, and the heads of agreement were initialed in Istanbul between the delegations on the 29th of March. Now, what happened was that in the very first weeks of the war, right after the war began, the Germans, the French, the Americans, and the British appeared to support negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And then, to their horror, they realized that those negotiations were going to result in an end to the war and a peaceful outcome to the crisis. So what then happened was that they brought together, they rushed together, they called together a meeting, a NATO summit meeting on the 24th of March. This is 5 days before the heads of agreement were initialed. Biden, who doesn't travel very much, flew in all the way from the United States. He met with all of these people, with Scholz, Macron, Johnson, Draghi, and they all then said, this is unacceptable. We don't like this at all. They started to impose unacceptable conditions for Ukraine to move forward with the peace. And then, of course, as we know, Johnson, who clearly was appointed the person to convey the bad news, first he telephoned Zelensky, and then he traveled to Kiev, and he made sure that the entire peace agreement was demolished. And this timeline that we've now been provided also, by the way, confirms something else, which of course we've always known, but those events, those alleged atrocities in that northern suburb of Kiev had nothing to do with the collapse of the negotiations. The decision to sabotage the negotiations was made before that happened. Now, that opens the question of why did all of these countries, the United States, Britain, Germany, as you rightly say as well, the Germans were also horrified that the negotiations were about to succeed. Macron and Draghi going along with the crowd. Why did they all decide at that last moment, that they would sabotage talks, that they would prevent peace being agreed? Well, I think the straightforward answer, the answer is very simple, and it's actually there in some of the things that people were saying at the time. Biden said in a speech in Warsaw, Johnson said when he visited Kiev, which is that they wanted regime change. They wanted to use the war to engineer regime change in Moscow. That was why the war happened in the first place. That is why they wanted the war prolonged. They still thought at this time, in fact, they were sure at this time, we're talking about March 2022, that the sanctions would have their effect, the military pressure on the Russians would also have its effect. They all believed that all they needed to do was to keep the pressure on the Russians a little longer and they were going to get their regime change. So they did not want a peace that would deprive them of that war and of their regime change operation in Moscow. This document makes it absolutely clear, to my mind, who wanted peace and who wanted war. The West wanted the war at that time. Certainly the Russians and the Ukrainians also wanted peace. It was the West that was driving this crisis all along and which has brought us to the situation in which we're in today.